Welcome everybody to this Axon live coding session that I, Steven, the Axon Framework lead developer for Axonic, will provide to you guys. It's going to be a bit different than the other live coding sessions I've done, which you might have seen or might not have seen online, where I typically start from scratch and code everything by hand. Now, I wanted for this case to focus a little bit on the 4.4 features we have provided in our most recent release, 4.4, for Axon Framework and for server side of things, because I felt that would be a bit more interesting, a bit more flashy, especially for an Axonic conference. I'm assuming that everybody has a bit of a feel what I'm going to do with having a command model and query model and having the API. Just showing the new things would be, well, the most ideal thing to do. So you should all be seeing my IntelliJ, an empty screen. I've obviously prepared a sample project. Let's open the project paradigm. So you can see that I've called this a game rental. So this is a game rental application. We'll see what this can do in a couple. You see the regular files like git ignore, maven wrappers, partake in here, readme. I've got two HTTP files ready, which you can use in IntelliJ, which I'm going to use for testing later on. For now, it's nice to focus on the POM, I'd say. Here you can see that this is a Spring Boot starter because the parent is a Spring Boot starter. So it's a simple Spring Boot application using Java 11, Axon Framework version 4.4.3. Dependency wise, that means I'm going to use the Axon Spring Boot starter, also data JPA and Webflux. H2 is a database, all straightforward. And well, here is the first new thing I can show already. So this dependency is obviously not overly new. Spring Boot DevTools has been around for some time, but we have only recently started supporting it from the framework from the get-go. So this has been a feature for those who are looking at our repositories on GitHub. You might have seen this pop up a lot, and where we stated that it wasn't supported just yet. You were required to do some things on your own. Well, there's no real way of saying why it took so long. Other things had more precedence, I guess. But still, it's now there, and I'm going to use it for the session as well, because I think it's nice. It's a good thing to use in your code to be able to, well, develop a lot more quicker. So having said that, we can go to our source file field and showing some of the things we have. The main Java, here we have our game rental application, the main app, just a Spring Boot application, nothing more interesting about it. The application configuration contains two interesting things. One being that I've defined a distinct type of serializer to be my message serializer, meaning that this will be used for my commands, events, queries, and their responses. And I'm going to use for that the Jackson serializer. I've defined some other things because, well, I needed that. I just want my messages to be serializable and deserializable through this process. Another thing here is the routing strategy. This is a bean which will be used by a distributed command bus implementation to find where to route a command to. Now, the default one would be an annotation one, but it would throw an exception if no key can be found. Now, I decided to, just pick a random key if no key is found in a command message being dispatched, because I want to be a bit more safe from that perspective. Okay. That's all the application configuration there is. So we can move over to the core API. So our messages I have derived for this game rental application. And we start off with this because, well, any well thought of CQRS, DDD and Event Sourcing application would likely start with something like event storming or event modeling, very nicely starting you off with the messages you want to use. So that's what I'm going to do as well. So we can move over to our core API, the main package we're going to share with whomever wants to deal with this app. You can see a bunch of Java classes. First we go to the commands. You can see we can register a game, rent a game, and return a game. I think that sounds reasonable for a game rental store. You can see that the register game contains a lot of information, definitely the target aggregate identifier. There's a title, description, single player, or multiplayer booleans, information like that. Sounds fair. Renting a game defines also the renter who's going to rent a game. Similarly, the return game defines that as a returner. So apparently we need this information for a form of validation later on. Sounds reasonable. The events are rough mirrors of that. You can see that's all just a simple POJO, and that I'm using the add constructor properties annotation to make it work through the Jackson serializer. Now, that's it for the commands and the events. We also have two queries in here. One is the full game catalog query, which you can see is pretty empty because you just want to do a full game catalog query. You just want to get everything. The find game query does base itself on a game identifier because you want to find a given game. The response type defined for this query is the game we have up here. So we have a dedicated game object, part of our core API, which will be the contents of a return object. See, pretty straightforward. This would be our query response, essentially. Now, having stated this would be the moment where you would introduce the command side of our application, the command model, so to say. Now, as I pointed out, normally I would do this from scratch, but I want to focus a little bit on the new features. So instead of doing this by scratch, I've prepared it. And I'm going to do git reset remain hard to step 2. Yes, step 2. And we see that I've changed the head of our application. And we can go back and we should have a new package in there. Here we see that I've derived this as the command package because I want to do a clean segregation of our concerns. And I'm going to start this off with a packaging segregation. So this command package is all on its own. Here we can see that we have an aggregate, which is called a game. So this is our entire command model with some specifics you would require to let it work through Axon. You can see I made it a package private thing because, well, nobody outside of the command package should actually be dealing with this aggregate at all. So why not make it package private so that you're a bit more enclosed? We're using the Spring stereotype from Axon to make this an aggregate to get all the required necessities out of the box. And well, we see some state in here. This thus is state we need for validation, which we see in a couple. And a logical one is the aggregate identifier, always a hard requirement when creating an aggregate. Now, the registered game command creates the game, sounds reasonable, and we publish the game registered event if that occurs, no validation whatsoever. When it comes to renting a game, however, we do have some validation. So you can see there's a notion of stock we have as state in the game. So, well, apparently this game rental shop can contain several instances of a given game. Sounds reasonable. You want to earn more money, so you want to rent out more, potentially. But you need to validate that there is sufficient stock prior to being able to rent a game. So we do just that. We check whether the stock is not 0 or lower than 0. And if it is, then we throw an illegal state exception, saying that there are insufficient items in stock. We do a similar validation for the release date. So we see that the release date here is stored. Well, I'm assuming this is because game rental shops shouldn't be allowed to rent out a game which hasn't been released yet. I think that's pretty fair, actually. There's a release date on those things. So we validate that. If the instant.now is before the given release date, if it is, then, well, we could throw an illegal state exception that this game cannot be rented out yet. Sounds fair to me. And if either of those is not the case, then we publish a game rented event. The return game command also has a validation. Here we check whether the renters, which is a set of strings we have up here, contains the guy or gal who's returning the game. So apparently there's a rule that when I rent out a game from this game shop, that I should also be the one to return it. Likely you could solve this with an identification system or maybe some cards you could use, but in this case, well, this is how it's been derived. If you're renting a game, you should be returning it. Kind of stringent, but it is a validation we do. If this is not the case, so if the returner of the command is not present in the renter set, then we throw another illegal state exception, and otherwise the game can be returned. Now, this also means that all three have event sourcing handlers in place. To set up the state, we've just derived the identifier as a hard requirement, the stock, which for now is always defaulted to 1, might change in the future, who knows, the release date, and defining the empty set of renters, and we change that on game rented and game returned. Now, essentially, we now already have an application we can run because, well, we have our API, we have a thing which can handle that API, so we can run this guy, and if somebody can dispatch those commands, we have a working thing. So this is a moment where I can actually show the Spring Boot DevTools, but also something additional. As you might have noticed from recent years, we're focusing heavily on Axon Server because we see great benefit in having that as a dedicated messaging platform, solving a lot of your issues for you. Now, I could spin up Axon Server locally right now. I indeed could do that, but I am not gonna. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna move to the Axon Cloud console, so our cloud environment, where you could just tap into Axon Server instances through the cloud. You can see this is the login page. I need to sign in with Google. That's my preferred mode, at least. I'm going to use my work email. I'm going to connect to the clouds, as you can see. And here I got, well, the empty dashboard with 0 connected applications right now. And I see I need to switch spaces because there's a notion of spaces as well. If you would start up for the first time, you would need to define the space you want to work in. Essentially, this space could be from your from the client you're working for, or maybe you have a personal test space or another one. You can see that this is my test space. I also got the notion of space management in place so that I can manage my own space, so to say. Now, this is how we can essentially connect our applications, but we don't have any. And the reason why we don't have any is because we're building from scratch, right? So we need to get this going. We first need to define a context where our game is going to be a part of. Quite similar to the notion of a bounded context when it comes to DDD. In this case, we're also reflecting that in here, that you can define a context where your application is going to run in, which are part of the contexts view. So we go to the contexts. Here you can see I have a thing I've called the Stevosphere, which I use for personal testing. See some information on it. This isn't what we're going to use for a game rental application. We're going to get a dedicated one. So I'm going to define a new context, call it a game rental. I'm going to choose for a beta clustered because I want to have a clustered Axon server setup. I'm going to save it. You can see it was pretty quick. I've created my context. You do see that the name is a little bit different. From my perspective, it's called game rental, but from the entire sphere, it's called game rental at Steven van Beelen, axonic.io. So adding my space to it because that is important. You saw the error up there. Should be important to know that this is still in beta, but you can all just use this and try this out. And I very much suggest you to do so because it's a very nice way to, well, kickstart a sample project. All right. So from this, we have our context in place. We have the game rental context defined. Now we need to define how we're going to bind our application. So we go to the application bindings page, and this is really there to make sure that we have a secure connection between the cloud and your application. So if we want to create an application binding, we just simply click the plus button. We give it a name. I'm going to call this the game rental application in this case, because it's the bare bones. And I can define the context it's going to partake in. You can see I can select several if I want. For now, the game rental is sufficient because that's the context we are living in. And we're going to save it. This might take some time. We again see that warning. Again, this is just beta. I've seen it pop up more often, but it still keeps working. What I'm now going to be presented with is, you can see an application token. So this really is the key for our game rental application to connect to Axon Cloud, to get access to the door. So if you should always be protective of this key, because if you lose it, there's no way to get it back. You essentially just lost your key. You need to create a new one. So that would mean you would need to create a new application binding. You should be warned that it wouldn't mean you would lose your events, for example. They can still be remained. If you pick the same name, it's going to be safeguarded, but keeping the key is important. So store it in some key store or vault solution or whatever. Now, in my scenario, we can be quick and use the application config up here. We can just copy it, and this is what we can move to our application properties file. So go to the resources, into the application properties. Here we see that we have some additional information I didn't show because I didn't figure it was too important. Now we define the servers in the cloud. We have a keep lifetime, SSL is being enabled. We've defined the context we are in, which mirrors the context we saw on the context page, and the token. And essentially, this is something we can run. So let's do that and see what's going to happen. So it first needs to build, obviously, because it's a bare, simple application. See that the target has popped up here. It's going to start. And let's hope the demo goals are nice enough. And yes, the game started. So this means we should be able to see some additional things. If we close this, we should now on our dashboard see our application. Hooray, it did. You see that we've called it the game rental application. This really mirrors the name you would give it into your property file. You see that this is similar. Go back again, we see some other things. We see that the context is game rental. We see that there's a single instance running and that there can be 3 commands handled by this thing. Super cool. I think from this stage, it's time to introduce a new component into the mix. Essentially the query side, because what we have defined our query API as well. We have to find game query and find full game catalog. We should be able to support that. So we need to store that query model. This is where I'm not going back into coding. I'm just going to move over a step because, well, it's not super interesting to see this built from scratch right now. We can just do it as such, move it over to the following step. We can go back and we see some changes. Furthermore, we see one of the changes, and that's that the token is not something I've pushed because, well, the token is my key. It's not a key I should be sharing with everybody, right? So I've guarded myself by doing that. So now we can see that next to our core API package, so the main thing we share with everybody, and our command package, which we have protected a little bit by making the classes package private, we now also have a query package, essentially the query side in the CQRS diagram scenario. So here we have three things, one being the game view. This is the model we're going to store. You can see that this is a simple entity with that entity annotation. It's also package private because I want it to be part of this package only, and I want to be protective of it because this is my internal idea of how I'm going to store this. I'm not want to share this with everybody or with the outside world. We see that all the fields we could push through the commands and events are here as well. So nothing too exciting. The only interesting thing is that there's an increment and a decrement stock operation because, well, that can change when you're renting or returning a game. Next to that, there's a game view repository. This is why Spring Data JPA was on the class path, because I make this as a JPA repository to make it simple from my end. Also package private. Then we have our game catalog projector, and you might have guessed it, again, package private. And let's go over this to see what we're doing up here. So we're making this a Spring component so that Axon in its Spring environment can automatically see all the message handling functions and attach them to the right buses. We're also adding the add processing group annotation to give it a dedicated name so that we can more easily tap into non-functional requirements we might want to do on our tracking event processor, the guy in charge of providing all the events to our game catalog projector. We're using the view repository to store in. We also have a query update emitter to support subscription queries, and we have 3 event handlers in here. One for the game registered event. This is when we save a new game. Pretty straightforward, but this is also where we emit to the full game catalog query that a new title has been added. So if somebody is tracking the full game catalog query constantly to see whether when new games are introduced, that would emit an update to that guy or gal who is tracking through the update emitter. Now, the other event handlers are a bit different. Here we see that we find an instance, and, well, the repository gives us an optional. If it's present, we decrement the stock for a game rented and incremented it for returned. If it's not present, we throw an illegal argument exception, stating that the game could not be found with this given ID. I think that's fair because, well, it's a warning to note, well, something is wrong, something is broken in your system. Maybe you've lost some of your views, your database is disconnected, who knows. I think throwing exceptions is fair. These are all the events we have, so we can move over to the query handlers, which are also part of this guy. So the first one is the find game query. We have the add query handler annotation to make it so, as you can see, and we find a game by doing the find by ID based on the game identifier. And here we do a funky thing, we map it. If you might recall, I have defined a dedicated game response, which isn't, essentially contains the same things as the game view, but I want those to be segregated because the game view is specific on how I store my query model, and I don't want to leak those specifics to the outside world, whilst the game in my core API is something I should be sharing with everybody. That's public. So that's part whoever wants to talk my game rental context in my application sphere should know that if they're interested in a game, they will get this object. And I just want to segregate that from the entity I'm actually using. This does mean I need to map it back to a game, which I think is fair because now we are, being nicely segregated, which is the thing we want to do. Furthermore, if finding didn't occur anything, then we throw an exception, similarly as with the game returned and game rented event. I think that's also, again, pretty fair because if you want to find a game which doesn't exist, you should be told so. All right, and then we have another query handler in here for the full game catalog query. You can see that returns a list of string, which essentially is the titles, which you already saw in the query update emitter. Now, having this in place, we should be able to get the goodness of Spring Boot DevTools by simply building it again, and it should auto-connect. So let's see if this is actually going to occur. All right, so you see that I've built it, and it was unconnecting some things and starting up again. We also see some new things popping up. We see that the games are being registered. We also see a token being fetched because we now have a tracking event processor in place because we introduced the game catalog projector. This also means I can show some new things on the dashboard. So going back here, you see that we now also have 2 queries in here. If we click this, we have some information. We can see the fully qualified class name of the commands and of the queries, and we see our event processor, the game catalog processor, which we introduced. Furthermore, we see the number of segments which have been claimed, so how much threads are actually processing work. And also got the similar operations you would have on an Axon server regular dashboard, so I can split, making it so that we will have 2 threads which are processing events. This obviously takes some time, as it always does, and well, here we see that they are popped up and starting work. Great, so we still have everything working. That's very nice. The demo gods are kind to me. There's one major thing missing, and that's tailed here in the position being 0. We haven't got any events yet. We haven't published any messages. This is the moment where we should introduce the UI. And this also is the moment I'm gonna actually do some coding. I've already shown some new things with the cloud and with Spring Boot DevTools, but now I want to show an additional new thing. So we're going back here. Let's move the run pane. What I'm gonna do is introduce a new dependency. So I'm going to the POM file. I'm gonna, in other dependencies, I'm gonna add the reactor dependency, like so. Here you can see that I'm introducing Project Reactor. Well, nothing new, but what is new is the Axon Reactor Spring Boot Starter, which I'm introducing. So this essentially is a new extension we have provided in our most recent release, so that you can tap into the goodness of Project Reactor using monos and using fluxes. As it stands right now, this extension only provides you an easier means of the gateways, so that you can tap into this. Eventually we will expand on this, that more and more Axon components will become reactive through Project Reactor. For now though, this is what I'm going to focus on, which taps in very nicely with the fact that we need to create a UI, because we're going to use the command gateways and the query gateway. So what we're first going to do is introduce a new package, which I'm going to call UI, and I'm going to introduce the game rental controller, because we need to have a controller in place, and I need to have some bare bones in here, and I'm going to be lazy. I'm just going to do some live templating because, well, you guys seeing me create a REST controller from scratch, you could do that somewhere else as well. This is an Axon specific live coding session. I'm going to go over it regardless. You can see it's a REST controller, a request mapping on /rental, and I've defined a game DTO, which I made a private static class. This is going to be used when you're registering a game. So let's have Maven solve the dependencies, because this is where we're going to introduce our new gateways, private final reactor command gateway. And it's likely not going to be happy for now because it's still figuring out the dependencies. But let me just type away at it like so. And yes, this is what I was expecting. And I was hoping it would do its thing. Here it is, import class, import class. So now I got my new gateways. I'm going to add them into a constructor so we can actually use them. Yes, I know the build output failed. I'm sorry. That's because the dependencies weren't there. So now we have our command gateways, and we can actually show what they look like. So this is the point where I need to introduce some get and post mappings. Again, not super Axon specific, so I've set this up like such. This is not the one I wanted to do. Yes, this is the one I needed. So you can see I've got a bunch of live templates up my sleeve to make this a bit quicker. I wanted to have an empty, essentially empty register operation so that I can show the command gateway. You see I'm doing a post mapping. I'm returning a mono string because this is registering a game, thus creating an aggregate, thus by default returning you the aggregate identifier. So in here we can do command gateway dot. These are the new operations we have. There's a send, simply returning you a mono, and there's a send and all. So the send and all is pretty neat. You can see that it ingests a publisher of commands. Essentially, this is a flux of things which provide you commands. So what you could, for example, do is if you have another stream, a reactive stream, maybe you're using the reactive rabbit solution or RSocket or whatever, and you could make that into a publisher, which you would automatically push into the command gateway.sendAll. so that it automatically maps all those messages coming through from a different context into the commands you want to deal with up here. Very neat, very strong power. And not something I'm going to show today. I'm going to base myself on a simple send and use the mono I'm going to be returned because, well, that's just for now is fine. I do want to show you because it is interesting to see. We're going to do a register game and we're going to do a build register game command like so. Ooh, this is all from scratch, so I'm now doing a double. All right, my apologies here. This would be the right format. All right, so we can now publish a register game command. We want to do a similar thing for renting and returning. So we do a rent and a return. Well, as these are just another post mappings using the same command gateway, I felt it reasonable to just live template them for you guys. So now we can do a similar thing for the queries we have, the two types of queries. So the find game query and the full game catalog query. So we're going to do an empty find game so that we can move over to using the query gateway. This also has a more extensive API because, well, there essentially are three ways of doing queries, right? You can do a point-to-point query, scatter-gather, or a subscription query, and all of those have some new knobs and bolts under the hood for this extension. One of these is, again, the publisher you can use, similarly as with the command gateway, but now for a simple query, for a subscription query, or for scatter-gather. You can also see it. And there are, some more interesting things on the subscription query side of things. For example, there's a query updates query. This essentially is a subscription query under the hood, but only tapping into the updates, so not the initial result at all. Because there might be scenarios that you're only interested in updates. You don't care about the initial result. So you can use this hook automatically so that it's a bit quicker for your end. Similarly, we have subscription queries with the publishers, as you can see. There's a nice subscription query many, which we'll see in a couple. Now, for this query handler though, we just want to find a given game, so we can come by with the simple, query like so. So we want to do a build find game query like so. Introduce the identifier, add the game as a class, and that's that. We can also do a find catalog. We have it. That's interesting, not too different, of course, because now we just want to have multiple instances. We can also do a subscription query. So we're going to do a watch catalog. And this taps into this query update emitter we already had installed on our game projector, the game catalog projector we have up here. And now in this case, we're doing a subscription query many, as you can see. So this is interesting in the form that we here assume that the initial result of the subscription query is a collection and the subsequent updates are singular instances. So we can define a single type because both of those types, although the one being a collection of it and the other being singular, are the same type. So we can automatically already put them into one flux for you, so you can tap into that more nicely. I also think that this one is pretty strong because you see this format pretty often, that you just want to do a subscription query and you want to get everything. You're not just concerned with separate initial and updates. You want them to be a singular thing. So you would be doing this on your own accord. Another thing which is important to note in here is that in the frameworks, the regular framework, when you're using subscription queries, you are required to close your subscriptions eventually yourself. In the try catch, for example, this will guard you against that if you forget that, because the reactor extension does this for you out of the box. Pretty neat, I would say. This also brings me to the point I can actually run this again. So let's do that. And I'm pretty confident it's going to break, because, well, we introduced a new dependency. And I believe that it's not working nicely with that here. We see that it couldn't find the class, even though that it all works. So we need to run it from scratch again. So let's do just that. Let me have a little sip of water. Talking so much, right? All right. So we see that the application is running. We got our two segments. And well, we eventually now have something we can test out. So this is the moment where I can show off my HTTP files, which I've introduced. So first we're going to register a bunch of games. So you see that we got a game called Doom we can register. Command & Conquer, very lovely game. Hello Combat Evolved. Let's just run all of these because we want to have a set of games we can use. So we can check them. All should be returning response code 200. Yes, they are. So that is great. This means we can test out the other components. So we go to our other requests up here. Got a bunch of things we can do. Let's find out game 1337, which should be Cyberpunk 2077, a new game coming out in, well, essentially about a month from now. So you can see that we get our game response essentially because we get the title, the release date, description, single player, and multiplayer, which obviously reflect what we have up here, these 5 fields. Great. This all works. Let's see some other things out of the box. We want to find the full catalog. You can see we get an array of all the instances we have. And now, well, let's see how it works when it comes to actually renting games. Let's assume Allard is going to rent out game 1, 2, 3, 4. Returns an OK, which you would expect from command handling, just an OK or a not OK if something fails. I'm going to rent out game 5, 6, 7, 8, and Lucas is going to rent out game 9, 0, 1, 2. All working fine. Now let's see some faulty scenarios. Let's assume that Stefan E is going to rent out game 5, 6, 7, 8, which I'm already renting. And currently there's only a single item in stock, so this should fail. Here we see we get a pretty big exception in our face, a command execution exception of insufficient items in stock. Okay, well, this works. Similarly, we should have this for the release date. So game 1337, which was Cyberpunk, has not been released yet, so this should fail. Again, pretty big stack trace with the game for this identifier has not been released yet. All right, also working. And we should see a similar thing for returning. So I'm first going to return my own game. This works out fine. Now I'm going to return Allard's game, 1, 2, 3, 4, which also fails because I'm not the original guy who rented the game. All right, pretty decent. We should have a similar exception when it comes to finding a non-existing game. So let's try that out. That would encompass all the exceptions we have. All right, game with ID 000 could not be found. And we see a query execution exception. Now, there's a reason why I'm showing this, because for those who have been using Axon Framework with server, or well, recently actually with a distributed message bus, you see that we wrapped the exceptions you throw into a command execution exception or a query execution exception. So as you might have noticed, so this is the query execution exception, right? If we go to our projector, this is not the exception I'm throwing. I'm throwing a legal argument exception. Now, the reasoning behind this is that you might be using your own defined exceptions, which naturally need to be part of the class path on the dispatching end to be able to be deserialized. As we are not certain of this, that you've done this, we automatically wrap any exceptions you throw into a dedicated query execution exception when it's query handling and a command execution exception when it's command handling, so that we are safeguarded against potential issues when it comes to serialization. Now, this does not mean you cannot provide your own specifics. You see that the message is automatically pushed over, but you might want to have some additional logic. You want to react differently on the type of exception you're getting. So you want to be able to map that to a form of solution, to essentially an exceptional API as well. So let's do something like that. Let's build our exception API. So this means, as I'm talking about the API, that we're going to start off with our core API. We're going to tap into these specific type of exceptions, and you'll see in a couple. So what I'm going to introduce is a rental command exception, like so, which is going to extend the command execution exception, and I'm going to create a constructor with these 3 things. Now, the reason I'm going to create it as a command execution exception because this is what the framework looks for. If it's a command execution exception, it will just push it through because it's a type we know. There's, however, an additional thing. We see we can add the message, which was already populated for us. We see the cause. We can also provide details, and it's these specific details which will be serialized and deserialized for you, so that you can tap into your own specific exceptional API, so you will. Prior to making that, we're going to make a rental query, typing is hard, exception as well, like so. The query execution exception, also going to create a constructor out of the box. Now, we got these 2 exceptions, which we can now go and throw from our message handling functions, but we haven't defined these details yet. I think a very reasonable start for details is to actually have a form of status codes. It's essentially what HTTP does as well. So why can't we do this? exception. Ooh. Exceptional status code. So to be very honest with you, I forgot what the live template was. Exception status codes. Yes, okay, that's what I called it. And that's obviously an issue when you're naming things. So can I actually rename this? Yes, I can. Okay, I think I fucked it up. So I'm just gonna make a new one and be a bit lazy about it. I'm gonna retrieve this guy, gonna drop it. You know, this is what you get when you're doing live demos, right? This just happens. So I've got my enum, and you can see I've also live templated this because I want this enum to reflect the types of exceptions we have currently defined, so that you're having insufficient items, that the game hasn't been released yet, that somebody else is returning it and that the game cannot be found, and a final one, an unknown exception, just to cover up for that scenario. All right, so essentially these are the exceptions we want to throw instead of these illegal state and illegal argument exceptions we are currently throwing. So what we could do is in every handler, we could change that. So we could change this illegal state exception to be the specific exception we have. That works, but there's a nicer thing you could do. One of which is defining a message handler interceptor, which does this for you out of the box, seeing the exception being thrown and adjusting this or mapping this essentially to one of our status codes. There's however a newer feature, and this is also one of the things I wanted to show. What I'm going to do is going to introduce an exception handler for the illegal state exception in this case. So this is a new type of, well, essentially a message handler we have in the framework. And under the hoods, it's a type of message handler interceptor specifically for this component. So you can define it to be specific how you would deal, in this case, with our command model. So what this guy is going to do is going to be invoked as soon as an illegal state exception is being thrown from any message handling function in this component, so we can react to it accordingly. Now this would require me to make the mapping from the illegal state exception to the new rental command execution exception. This is also rather boring because it's just an if-else block. So what I'm going to do is the exceptional command model. As you can see, here we have defined our status codes and we check for the contents in the message and change the status code based on this. You could likely make this a bit more nicer by adding this to the enum as logic, would work too. Anyhow, this is what I've chosen here, just simple if-elses, and we throw a rental game execution exception from here. So part of our new API. Obviously, we want to do a similar thing for the game catalog query projector. So we're going to introduce this handler, in this case for an illegal argument exception, like so. And well, I'm going to be lazy again. We're going to do this if-else based on the messages being thrown and otherwise an unknown. And then we throw a rental query execution exception. Pretty neat. Very happy with this. Now, this is it from the handling perspective. But now what happens if I'm dispatching one of these messages and I get these exceptions? I'm still not really resolving this to my type of exception I want to deal with, because I'm essentially still getting the thing the distributed bus returns, being a query execution exception, whilst we want it to be a rental query execution exception. So we need to move over to our dispatching end, being the UI, into the game rental controller, and we essentially want to do something when an error occurs. This is also where Project Reactor is pretty nice, because we can do an on-error map. And on an error, we can retrieve throwable and adjust it to something else. So that's what we're going to do, but we first need this method to do the mapping, essentially, from the exception we're getting. Exception mapper UI. You see that I've also prepared this. Here you see that we have a function, a static one, mapping a remote exception to a new type of throwable. We check whether it's command execution or query. If it is, we check whether the details are present. And if those details are present, we're assuming we're using our exception status code API. And I think this is a fair assumption because we're in our game rental context. And wherever in our game rental context, this would be the mode we're going to choose. So if there is an exceptional scenario, we would anticipate an exception status code. Now, instead of providing the entire message, the cause, and then the status code, we're just using the description from the status code and then providing this as details again. That's it. So that you're no longer tapped into this entire big stack trace, that you're only sharing the specific bits you want to show. All right, so this could be a method we introduce on the on-error map. We could do this like so, make this a static operation. This would work fine, but this is not what I want to do. I want to show another thing, because essentially we'd need to add this on-error map to each of our instances everywhere. This would be a very nice fit for an interceptor, and obviously we have just that. So what I'm going to do is command gateway dot register result handler interceptor. This is a new type of interceptor which currently is only provided from the reactor extension, because this gives us a nice means to tap into the results. And here we can define our reactor result handler interceptor, and one of those results are the exceptions. So we can tap into that right here. So this is essentially just a by function, giving the initial command and the result. So this is why I'm typing it as such. And on the result, we can do the on-error map like so. And this is where we invoke our new method. Hooray. So we got this going. We can obviously do a similar thing for the query gateway. So let's do just that. Ooh, I don't like this indentation. What are you doing? This is why it's doing that. Like so. All right. And well, we need to change this obviously to being the query gateway. And it would be nice to make this a query as well. I think that's only fair. You could also use this for different formats, right? So especially from queries, you might want to end up if it takes too long. So if the result takes too long to come in, you can do a timeout. If it wants to type it with a duration of, well, let's say 500 milliseconds. It might be just a non-functional requirement you have in your system that you want to tap into this. This is pretty neat, because now I don't have to use this on-error map. And essentially, I have something again I can run. So let's do the Spring Boot DevTools magic and just build it, parse it again. You see that it's unregistering some of the handlers. It should automatically go registering them again. And luckily it is. So this allows me to test out these new endpoints we have created, these new exceptional scenarios. So we're going back to our other requests object. This should still work fine. Right? Yes, this still works fine. I should be able to rent out this game again because I unrented it. Yes, this works. Now let's see what happens if Stefan wants to rent out the same game. We get our rental command exception with the insufficient items in stock. So a more nicer, friendlier API to our users instead of the internals of what is actually failing. Now we're being protective of what we're sharing with the outside world. You see that this looks, well, a little bit nicer as well than what we had previously. And this should similarly work for any of our other handlers. So if Stefan A tries to rent out a game which hasn't been released yet, this should work. It's unfortunately not been released. If I'm trying to return the game for Allard, that should also fail. Similarly with an exception. I'm very happy with this. Now, this is essentially all the new features I wanted to show from the framework in this day. There are some last things we can focus on when we go back to the dashboard because, well, I've shown the dashboard page, showing the applications you've connected. We have seen the contexts page where you can define new context for your applications, the application bindings, but there's also a notion of statistics. It's these statistics which will be the derivative for the payments you would have to do because, well, this is nice. Beta is still going to be free, but you need to, well, test this out, right? We need to have some metrics to get you to pay some value to it. So you can see that we're storing the number of events, the bytes, the commands executed, also in byte size, because the size of the messages definitely makes sense, is important for what is going to change. Similarly, we have an event store pane here so that we can search through our event store. We need to select the context we want to search in. If we just do a simple search, we'll get all the events we have in the store. We can also do a nice thing here with changing what we want to see. You can see it adjusts real quickly. If we just want to see the payload data, then we can just do this. And we got the payload data and the metadata. Seeing, by the way, that we're using the Jackson serializer. Well, this is essentially, now I'm really done. This is all I really wanted to show. I thank you very much for paying attention for the last almost 45 minutes. For me, it has been a pleasant experience. Hoping to talk to you likely on a closer venue once COVID is done. That would be great. Well, thanks again. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a nice day.